If story 3 doesn't give you the goosebumps, then you are a brave human. Because just me reading it and telling you the story, it gave me the chills. And wait till the end to see why. Because what they go through, no human should ever go through. Because it's horrifying. But with all that being said, let's begin. Henry McDaniels is a normal looking and sounding man that minds his own business. He would grow up the quiet life and would just have the quiet life all the way until something happened to him that would change his world upside down. From a normal everyday citizen to kind of a crazy guy. At around 8:30 p.m. on the night of April 25th, 1973 in the small town of Illinois, Henry was driving back home from a meeting, and while he was driving, he would occasionally just glance out the window because he wanted this drive to be over with. And the main fact was, well, because he just wanted to get home and just wanted to chill out for the day, as today's work and meetings had put a lot of stress on him. And also it was a Wednesday, so it was the middle of the week, and if you know anything about Wednesdays, and if you do have a job, you know that Wednesday's in the middle of finishing Monday, which is great, but also 2 days away from the weekend, which felt ages away. The weekend was something that Henry cherished a lot, because they were only the real free time that he would get to himself. Anyways, after some driving, he would eventually pull up to his front drive, and as he was pulling into the front drive, he just felt like his house felt off. He didn't know why. As he looked at his house, everything was off, which it should be, and the door to his house was closed, so there was nothing wrong. No windows were open, nothing was wrong, but it just felt off. So after parking up and sitting in the car, thinking of all the things that could possibly be off about his house, he would eventually just chalk it up to that he's just been working really hard, and that's just playing with his mind. And so ultimately he would eventually get out of his car and walk to his front door. And as he gets out of his car and walks to his front door, which isn't too far, he couldn't help himself to the fact that he felt watched. And to give you a better picture, in front of his house was a long line of bushes that kind of went around the house. And as he's walking to his door and begins to bring his keys out to open the door, he hears this rustling from the bushes next to him. Not the one that was close to him, but the one that was a bit far away. Now this rustling wasn't really loud. It's not the typical rustling that you would hear in a horror movie or something. It was pretty quiet. And the only reason that Henry heard this rustling because his neighborhood was dead quiet. There was no cars, no animals, no nothing. It was just silent. Henry's neighborhood wasn't like your typical American neighborhood where there's houses quite close to each other. In fact, they were pretty spread out, but not to the point where it was miles away from each other. They were like a 3 to 4 minute walk. For example, there was a house and then another house, and in between the houses was like a mini forest. There was just trees there, and it was something that you could go through, but it just doesn't make sense. And again, the forest was small, but it did kind of create a sense of privacy, because you'd have both of these small forests on each side, and there would just be a house. And these houses again were 5 to 10 minute walks away from each other, so it wasn't too far. And also you just get that privacy that I've just mentioned. So now you get the picture. Now Henry's staring at the direction of where this rustling came from, and he's contemplating to himself that should I go investigate? But eventually, as he got his key out and put the key in the hole, he was like, nah, there's no way. I'm too tired for this. I'm just not in the mood to get whatever rabbit or animal that was in the bushes. And so he would just walk into his house. Eventually, Henry would find himself sitting on the couch watching TV, forgetting about the whole ordeal. A whole hour later, so 10 p.m. now, Henry, who was kind of dozing off at this point, would suddenly jolt awake because he could hear something and it sounded strange. So he sat up from his chair listening closely, and he could clearly hear a scratching noise coming from his front door. Henry was definitely weirded out by this, so he would get up from his chair and he would begin to slowly walk towards the front door. Now his front door did have glass, but it wasn't the normal glass that you and me might have. It was like this glass where you could only see silhouettes if someone was in front of the glass. But it didn't really matter what glass it was, because as Henry poked his head towards the corridor where the front door was, he saw that there was no silhouette, there was no one there, but the sound of the scratching door continued. Now really on edge, Henry would walk through the corridor and then turn to his right and then go up the stairs into his room where his wife was still sleeping. He would grab his gun, he would grab a flashlight, and then he would slowly walk back downstairs into the living room where he just was. But this time he would poke his head through the curtains to get a side view of what was scratching at his front door. So once he slowly poked his head through the curtains, he could clearly see a silhouette of something that was poking out from the bushes that he had heard rustling from. Now with this adrenaline coursing through his veins, he would burst out through the front door with his gun and flashlight drawn. And once he drew his flashlight on this thing that was scratching at his front door, the thing would be startled by the presence of Henry. And as Henry saw what this was, he was horrified. This creature had 3 legs, a short body, 2 short arms, and along with that 2 pink eyes, and was approximately about 4 to 5 feet tall. So Henry looked at this creature for a second or two as this creature stood frozen, and Henry could see that this creature was trying to get into his house through the front door. And of course, not having any of that, Henry would shoot 4 shots at this creature. 3 out of the 4 would miss, but 1 would land. And once the shot landed, all Henry would have heard was this creature making this hissing sound, much like a wildcat, before fleeing around the house and through the back of the house, heading towards the nearby railway embankment. Now this gets scarier as Henry is now intrigued on what this thing was. So of course he would begin to chase this creature, but would quickly lose this creature because in a matter of 3 jumps, this creature would cover the distance of 50 feet. Again in 3 jumps. Henry would just watch in awe as he watched the creature just get to safety basically. Henry would just be in awe as he watched this creature jump so high up and jump so far away from him in a matter of 1 jump. And of course this would happen 3 times until the creature just disappeared. And after watching this, he would rush back home and call the authorities. The police of course wouldn't take this too seriously because this weird creature that sounded out of this world was scratching at your front door. Just doesn't seem real. So they would only send out 1 officer to investigate. And right as the officer met Henry at the front door, they would do some tests on Henry to see if he was sober and rational, which he was. And then once he saw that, he would begin to explore the property. But he would instantly see footprints that this creature had left, which was on the side of the house and also at the front of the house. It was described as dog-like in shape with 6 toe pads. This officer who was now looking at these footprints was stunned because, of course, he had never seen such footprints before. Now with this story, nothing of the monster was actually proven of, but this is an actual real story that was on the news and on newspapers. And also, to be fair with you, it had quite a lot of evidence behind it and was also believed by a lot of people, because when Henry went on to describe how this creature looked in further interviews, it didn't seem like he was exaggerating. In fact, it felt like he was terrified and he was reliving this moment as he was explaining to the interviewer on what he saw and what happened to him. Here are some images of the crime scene and also a rendered image of what Henry would have saw of this creature. It's not exact, but it's pretty close. So let me know in the comments down below if this was something out of space or was this something more explainable. The date is Saturday, 16th of June 1990. A woman by the name of Trevelyan Evans had just woken up from quite a sleepless night. She would have this sleepless night because she was so busy due to her and her husband who were renovating the holiday bungalow, which was a hassle for them. And also they had a shop to look after and it was getting close to reopen the shop. And so Evans would tell her husband that, you stay here and I'll go back and I'll open the shop and run it for the meantime. And so that's what they would do. Now laying in bed after just a couple of days back home, she saw that it was almost time to go to work. So she got up, got ready, had some breakfast, and then she head out straight away to work. She would arrive at her attic antique shop on Church Street, which was located in Llangollen, Wales. Llangollen is a small and quite rural town in Denbighshire, which was fueled by farming and tourism. It approximately had about 3,800 people living in the town, so it was quite the community where everyone knew each other, and she had lived in this town for literally all of her life and had no intentions of moving. So she had arrived in her and her husband's Ford Escort to work, and so she would park the car about 200 yards away from the shop. The first part of the day was quite busy since it was a nice day and also a Saturday, and tons of people were coming into her shop. And this wouldn't really upset Evan that she had to work so much, and especially the fact that she was by herself. It actually made her happy because business was booming. Many of those customers were locals and also a lot of her friends, and they would all recall seeing Evan working really hard but still have a smile on her face, and she just seemed overall relaxed. And that was many thanks to the fact that she had plans to go out tonight. So with this and the fact that the business was booming would keep her in good spirits. But around 12:40 AM, Evans would notice that she was missing something and she needed to go out. So she would grab a piece of paper and would begin to write on it, "Be back in 2 minutes." So as she leaves the shop, she would turn around, lock the door and put this piece of paper on the door. And then she would turn to face towards the street and then she would walk away. Now this is where it gets interesting and scary, because around about 2:30 PM she was last seen on Market Street, which was close to her home, but after that she was never seen again. When she turned to the side and looked into the street, well, thanks to some spectators that was nearby, they would say that there was this tall man that was right next to her, who was also very well dressed, and would walk up to her and would tell her something. None of them could understand what he was saying because they were too far away, but either way, once he finished what he was saying to Evans, she would leave the note on the door and then proceed to walk with him. Everything that she would usually keep with her and take home, such as a handbag, wallet, all them essential things, and obviously car keys and everything, you get it, were left behind in the shop, and again along with her car, and they would stay there of course until her husband came back and saw that she was gone. There were two more suspected sightings, both unconfirmed. At 2:35 p.m, a woman matching the same description as her was seen walking out of town along the A5 Corwin besides the Riverside Park, which was quite nearby. And another was at 3:45 p.m. There was another sighting, this time of a woman walking into a Park Avenue from the direction of the River Dee. Now, who this man who kind of prompted the sudden disappearance of Evans would never be identified, and no matter how big of the search team the police put together, they could never find her. She just disappeared. Now, our final story starts in 2004. A young 16-year-old girl named Misty was one of them traditional American teenage girls. She grew up living in Live Oak, Florida, which, if you don't know, is a small rural town in the middle of the state. And now, one Saturday evening on January, she and her mother would go and attend a church service. Once there, everything would go smoothly as per usual. And eventually, they found themselves packing up and then eventually getting onto the mother's truck. So they would drive along the county highway, making their way back home, which, for reference, was about 20 minutes away in car. And this highway was one road that would directly lead them from the church back to the house. There wasn't many left or rights that they needed to take. It was just a straight road basically. And even though this highway had its many perks and of course advantages, it also had many disadvantages, with one of the main facts that it was quite desolated and there was no buildings or houses for ages. And also there was no street lights, so it was basically pitch black once it got dark. And to be fair, even though it was technically called a highway, it was just mainly a dirt road that had forests on the left and the right. And again, during this entire highway length, there was no buildings, no houses, and again, just desolated. Now, giving you some heads up, Misty's mother was an experienced driver and had been driving for ages. But even though with all that experience up her belt, she was still quite the anxious driver. She would keep both hands on the wheel and would sit up and just overall keep her eyes fixated on the road, just like she was a new driver. Now, what I told you about her was her during the daytime, so you could only imagine when it turns night. Her driving and her confidence in driving gets 10 times worse, and she would always do her best not to drive in the night and will go to extreme lengths to do not so. But in this situation, the church service had went on for a bit longer than usual, so now Misty's mother is starting to drive as the sun's starting to set down, which you can imagine she is racing to get back home because there is no way in hell she wanted to drive in the night. So as they're bombing down this road at around 55 miles per hour, which by the way the road was 40 miles per hour, Misty, who was in the passenger seat, would look over to her mother with no particular reason. And as she's looking not at her mother but through her window, she would notice that there was a little girl sitting on the side of the road. So of course she's thinking to herself that what the heck's a little child sitting on the side of the road in the middle of nowhere, and certainly during this time. So of course she would tell her mother that I think I just saw a little girl on the side of the road. Misty's mother, who was again high up on the wheel and fully concentrated on the road, didn't hear Misty the first time. And so seeing that her mother didn't hear her, Misty would say it again, but in a louder tone this time. Hey mother, I think I seen a girl on the side of the road, and I think we should turn back and to make sure that she's okay. So now Misty's mother had finally heard it, and she would look over to Misty and would give her a look that she wasn't prepared to turn the car around. That just meant that she would have to stay out later, and that also means that she's going to be driving in even darker conditions. And so she's like, did you really see someone? Because you know we gotta get back home. And Misty to her mother was like, yeah, I'm pretty sure I just saw a little girl on the side of the road, so we have to turn back. So of course annoyed but also kind of worried for this girl, she would turn the car around 180 degrees. Now they only made it about half a mile from where Misty believed she saw the girl, and so pretty quickly they found themselves slowing down, because also Misty would say that I think the girl was in this area. So both of them began to scan the right side of the road, because well, that's where she was going to be now, because again when they were going through she was on the left side of the road, and of course if you do a 180 she's on the right side. Now that they turned around, it's starting to get really dark outside, but there was enough light where you could see enough with your headlights, and they were also pretty confident with the headlights they were going to find this girl on the right side of the road. So as they're slowly rolling down this road, they both see this girl a little ways up, and her back was against the road. She had her knees tucked up to her chest and she was rocking back and forward. Misty's mother would comment that this was definitely surprising, that there would just be this girl out here. I mean, again, there's nothing around her, and there's nothing around her for quite a while, not even a trail to be walking into this section and getting lost, so why is she here? So now Misty's mother would begin to roll up next to her, but she would tell Misty that instead of stopping straight away, let's drive past her and get a good look of her, and then we'll turn around and head back down and ask if she needs any help. And so as they got right next to her, they noticed that she wasn't a little girl. She was more like a young teenager. So as they drove right past her, they were expecting her to turn around and acknowledge that there's a random car coming up to her. And also considering that there's no other traffic in the area and you're just some person sitting on the side of the road, you should definitely turn around and see who was coming up against you. But this little girl would stay in her position and not acknowledge that Misty and her mother were rolling up on her. So Misty and her mother were a little bit freaked out by this, but they drive past her about 50 meters before ultimately Misty's mother does a 3-point turn. So as they're looking back down the road, where the girl should be on the left side of the road now, because now they're oriented back towards the house. So again, as they're rolling up to the location where she wasn't there anymore. And again, there was no street lights, and now it's completely dark. So all they really had now was just the headlights of the car. And so Misty told her mother that, drive a little ways up, because maybe she got up and began to walk forward, and that's why we just can't see her. So Misty's mother begins to drive down the road and kind of turning the headlights slightly towards the left to shine more light on the left side. But there was no sign of this girl. But for good measure, they turned the lights slightly to the right to see if she was on the right side of the road, but she wasn't. So Misty and her mother were just strolling slowly forward, looking left, looking right for several minutes, but still had no idea on where this girl went. So they thought that she must have gone into the woods and gone back to wherever the hell she came from. And with that, Misty's mother began to pick up the speed once again. And before long, they had gone about 2 to 3 miles from where they last seen the girl. And they were coming up to this 4-way intersection with stop signs all over. And as they were getting closer to this intersection, Misty's mother shrieked, because on the other side of this intersection, on the right side, was the girl sitting on the side of the road, and she's in the same position as she was a couple of miles back, her knees up, rocking back and forward, with again her back towards the road. So Misty's mother pulls up to the stop sign and then just sits there, and both women are just stunned on what they're looking at. They had just seen her 2 to 3 miles back down the road, and it wasn't possible for her to get all the way up there before them, which by the way, I forgot to mention that they were in a car and she was walking. And so Misty's mother is looking at Misty and saying that, do you think it's a different girl? And Misty's like, there's no way, this is the same girl. And so they would sit there until Misty would start to panic, and she would plead to her mother to not stop the car, because she had a bad feeling about this girl. She didn't know why, but she just did not want her mother stopping next to the girl. But Misty's mother was, again, definitely weirded out by this situation, but she didn't feel good about abandoning this girl in the middle of the night on the side of a highway. And so even though she felt herself a little bit hesitant, she told Misty that at least we gotta check up on her and to see if she's okay. That's the least we can do. And Misty wasn't having any of it. She was constantly pleading with her mother, do not stop no matter what. But Misty's mother lets off the brakes and slowly rolls towards this girl. And as she's rolling past the intersection onto the other side, Misty's now completely terrified. So much so, she takes the seatbelt off and jumps into the footwell, which was right in front of her seat. And she begins to close her eyes and cover her ears. And she would just continue to beg to her mother, please don't stop. But her mother just proceeds forward all the way until she stops right next to this girl, who again is still sitting on the side of the road, not acknowledging the two. And again, Misty's mother could see that she's not acknowledging them. So Misty's mother would tell Misty to roll down her window, but Misty refused and wasn't doing anything. And she was still in the footwell in the fetal position, and she's crying and begging to her mother that we need to go. So Misty's mother, who's now frustrated, would go across the passenger seat and manually open the window. So after rolling the window down, and Misty, who again was still in the footwell, would remember sitting there covering up her ears as she was crying, and then she would eventually open her eyes and look towards her mother, who was reaching over the seat and was yelling at this girl. And what happens next haunts her and her mother. All Misty remembers was the look of her mother, from being a concerned look to that changing to a look of absolute horror. Accompanied with that was a scream, and then the car would take off like a race car down the road. Misty jumps out of the footwell and just starts to ask, what did he see? What happened? And Misty's mother has her hands over her mouth as she's speeding down the road and also crying at the same time. And then she would look at Misty and have no words to describe what she had just seen. And so Misty's screaming at her mother, what did you see? What was it? And then finally her mother just said, she didn't have a face, it was hollow, and there was nothing there when she looked at me. And so once Misty heard that, she would begin to cry and scream as the two women drove back home. And once they got to the house, they burst into their house acting like this girl was chasing them, and they would lock the door and then call the police. But as they called the police, they didn't know what to explain and what to say to the cops, because again, it just didn't sound normal. It sounded quite embarrassing, but eventually would explain everything, and the police would go search out into this highway and would search this entire highway, but found nothing or any sign of anyone was ever there. So let me know, what do you think this was? Was this a ghost, or was this some sort of prank? I don't know. Let me know in the comments. But that'll be it for today's video of true crime stories. Intrigues or interesting, I would highly suggest you subscribe to my YouTube channel, as that's all I do and I upload once a week. And also let me know if these types of videos intrigues you as entertaining, because I'll make more if you guys like it. But with all that being said, I thank you for watching, and yeah, goodbye.